morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am very excited to be coming to you today with another version of our podcast and to be diving into something I think is really important, this idea of hidden forces and change, this idea of resistance and why these things happen, and then also how do we move through some of that? How do we get to a place of discovery with our clients? Remember last week we identified some of those stakeholders. Shine used a series of words to help us kind of understand primary client, contact client, and so on. We might think about that as a traditional stakeholder analysis. And then to introduce this idea of discovery so that we can move through hidden forces to get to a place where we can be very helpful with our clients. Both Shine and Block talk a lot about that in the reading, and I hope that this week's reading is really exciting for you. As you use that information, you apply it to your projects for class, but you also apply that information out to your own life. So I am ready to go today. I've got my Shine book here. We're all marked up. As you can see, I've got my cup of coffee. We're hanging out here at the house this morning, and we are just kind of diving into some new knowledge. So without further ado, let's get to some slides and get to some new content. To get started today, we're going to talk around these two areas. The first is the hidden forces of change, and the second is the idea of discovery and kind of introducing what does it really mean to discover something. So to get started, we're going to spend some time talking about the idea of communication. So if there are these hidden forces and these things that kind of automatically work against us, then why would we even begin to communicate? Like where, when, how, what, and who? How do we even begin the process of communication? So we turn to page 102. Actually, it starts on 101, and Shine talks about 6 different rules of communication. The first one is to make ourselves and our needs known to others so that those needs and aspirations can be satisfied. We must communicate our needs, right? From early on, we recognize the role of communication in telling people that we needed something. But we know that language is also very complicated. The second thing is to figure out others and what they're all about and to get to know them. We know that being able to ask questions and identify areas of satisfaction and threat, and perhaps most of all of mystery, are all about communicating with people. Learning about someone. When you're meeting somebody for the first time, what do they like to do? What do they love? What are their favorite colors? What kind of music do they like? How do we get to know somebody? And think about the role of communication and understanding, solving the mysteries of things that are all around us. The third thing is to make sense of ambiguous situations. We do that by sharing perceptions and insights, and there's no doubt about it that life really kind of throws at us a lot of different types of stimuli. Communication is the way in which we interact with the world, right? The fourth is to gain advantage by structuring situations to our own needs and to persuade, sell, convince, and teach other people. This is how we navigate our world in some ways. We communicate not only to make sense about structure and situations, but really about how we can take advantage of those situations. The fifth is to enable us to do more than we could by ourselves by establishing cooperative, helpful relationships with others. We partner with other people through communication. We make specific requests. We make asks. Hey, can you help me with dinner tonight? Hey, can you help me do this project? How can I be helpful for you in this consulting relationship? And then the sixth and final one is to fully express ourselves and to get to know ourselves through self-expression and to listening to what we have to say. Communication is an expressive art. It is expressive because we do it, and when we do it, it's fun and enlightening to see what comes out of our mouths. Oftentimes, we surprise ourselves by even what we can say and what we think. As some people might put it, I don't know what I think or feel until I actually hear what I have to say. So Shine goes about these 6 areas as focal points for communication. So the question begs, well, if communication is that easy, if it's just those 6 things, then why does resistance emerge? And we talked a little bit about this last week in our class, and we want to pull this forward into this week and the dialogue that we had around this idea. But we want to understand, well, why does resistance emerge? And Shine talks about that being an active helper requires a philosophy and a great deal of practice and a working theory around deciphering hidden forces and processes. What he means by that is that the world works to help us perceive, understand, simplify, explain, create, and perhaps even control what's going on. Good intentions are not enough because hidden forces surround us constantly. Make note that many of the forces that influence the outcome of relationships are actually hidden and or hard to decipher. So the things that are all around us, the things that might keep us back in a consulting relationship with someone and being able to really help, may be things that we are not even aware of. To move past this, Shine introduces what's called the Introphysics Process Model, or the ORJI model. So I really love the ORJI model, and to illustrate the point that Shine's making here, I want to read from a story that's actually in our textbook, and I typically won't do this. I won't read to you, but I just want to illustrate and highlight the point and the way in which we work in our minds to understand what's going on around us. And so, and I'm actually on page 91 if anybody wants to follow along with me. He says, a poignant example of this process was recently reported by an executive in one of our intensive executive development programs. Dave, the executive, was deeply involved in studying for a finance examination to be taken the next morning. He isolated himself in his den at home. He asked his 6-year-old not to disturb him, and a half an hour later, the child appeared in the doorway, thereby interrupting Dave. Dave immediately got angry because he had asked not to be disturbed, and he observed the child's entry as doing something that he had forbidden him to do. So he observed the child in the doorway, and he thought to himself, I asked not to be disturbed. Why are you disturbing me? And he's working through all of it. So he observes and he reacts into something. Dave, considering his anger entirely appropriate at that moment, which is a judgment that he's making, punished the child by yelling that he was not to be disturbed, which was the intervention. So we do this all the time, right? We observe, we react, and we make an intervention, right? So we walk through this model even in our own lives. He goes on to say, later on, Dave noticed that the child was really upset, aloof, and in other ways reacting more strongly than Dave thought was warranted. This new observation triggered a new feeling of tension, concern, and worry about the child. So, wait a second, what's going on here? So he's working through another cycle for this model, leading to the judgment that he should find out what was going on. Dave decided to ask his wife some questions. He actually intervened here again. Maybe I need to take some action. So anytime we have an intervention is when we're actually taking some action. These questions completed a second cycle. So he's actually gone through the model, the ORJI model, twice at this time. He's observed, he's reacted, he's made a judgment, and then he's done some intervention. Dave now learned that the child had come down to his wife's request to ask him if he wanted to have a cup of coffee and to say goodnight and kiss and hug his dad goodnight. Listening to this explanation made Dave feel guilty and ashamed for blowing up. He made the judgment that he was wrong to have acted hastily, and now decided to attempt to apologize and make up with his child, which is a third cycle of that model. It's another intervention. How often have we done that? How often have we observed something, right, and reacted based on our own assumptions of what's going on, based on our own biases and how we see what's happening in the world? Why are you disturbing me? What's wrong with you? I said leave me alone. I'm studying for a test, right? Just trying to give his dad a kiss and a hug at night, right? And we can extrapolate that lesson into all kinds of areas in our life. There's no doubt about it. We walk through this model all the time. Emotion is so very powerful, and don't underestimate that in a consulting relationship. We cannot underestimate the role of emotions and the influence, the powerful, powerful influences that emotions play based on our own observations of what's going on around us, how they play out in our relationships all the time. So if we put this model together, what Shine is really talking about here is that when external events happen, they precipitate this idea of observation, this expectation, and this prejudgments. And if you want to follow along with me, I'm here on page 93. And he talks about observation being things that we sense and perceive and describe, right? And that moves us over into reaction, where we have an emotional response. And here's the trigger point, right? The trigger point for judgment, this movement toward cognition, this analysis or evaluation, this cognitive appraisal about what is exactly going on. And then we move over into this idea of impulse, right? This volition, this decision, or this action, that this impulse intervention really kind of moves us in. And then we observe again based on our intervention, our impulse, and this cycle continues over and over and over. And Shine talks about traps, 4 different traps: misperception, which is what happened in the case of Dave; inappropriate emotional responses, which happen all the time. We probably know and work with people who have inappropriate emotional responses. rational analysis based on incorrect or bad data, and intervention based on an incorrect idea. How do we overcome these? How do we actually move past this? Shine offers 3 very poignant suggestions here. He says explicit questioning, silence, and a spirit of inquiry. Shine talks about the explicit questioning as something that we must do to counterbalance what we think we know. Is the information that we have actually correct? Perhaps one of the most important ways to avoid this trap is to test whether one's observations, reactions, and reasoning are actually correct. See, Dave's weren't. Sometimes ours aren't. The second is silence. One of the most important interventions that one can decide to use is to remain quiet. It's also one of the most disciplined things we can do. And the next time you have a conversation with somebody, try to remain silent. Try not to give, try not to bias, try not to offer, but rather listen, actively listen, and let silence be a very powerful tool. What we often see and hear while we are trying to struggle with ourselves to stay quiet reveals data that we need to make a more helpful decision. Right? So perhaps in the case of Dave, if he would have just looked at his child for a moment and been silent, perhaps his child would have run in and hugged his leg and said, "Good night, Daddy, I love you. Would you like a cup of coffee?" Yeah, it's very powerful, right? Sometimes silence can be one of the most powerful tools we can actually use. And then finally, the spirit of inquiry. Right? The best overall protection here is to remain curious. A spirit of inquiry. When the child comes in, Dave could have said, "Can I help you? Hey, sweetheart, what's going on? How can I help you today?" Right? What's going on? I'm curious. Why did you interrupt Daddy? And we do the same things with our clients. So while we are talking about a little child and his father, don't mistake the power dynamics here for what could be construed and extrapolated in terms of the consulting relationship. Because one person typically has power. Remember, there's this idea of power imbalance, and we have to work to create a more grounded sense of power. And we can do that through explicit questioning, remaining silence, and this idea of the spirit of inquiry. If we move this idea forward, our approach really matters here, right? Our approach matters to what's going on, to how we see the world. Our lens and the approach in which we use when we work with our clients matters. And here's a really good example of what that might look like. So here's a paperclip, right? And what if I asked you about a paperclip? So let's say that you have a paperclip, and I said, well, what are all of the things that you could actually do with a paperclip? What are all of the uses and possibilities for a paperclip? Well, we might be able to come up with literally hundreds, maybe thousands of uses for paperclips, right? I don't know. We might be able to look at some of this and say, well, we could use it to hold things together, but we could also use it to create art. We could use it to plug up something. We could use it in a variety of ways. And if I asked you to spend the next 10 minutes writing down all of the uses for the paperclip, you could come up with an exhaustive list, right? But we don't typically think about paperclips and what we can do with them. We think about them in their specific job, which is to hold papers together. And we limit our own lens for what something could be to what something actually is. And reciprocally, if I said, well, what are all the things that you can't do with a paperclip, right? We begin to broaden out our perspective here, and we make a list of all the things we can do and all the things that we can't do. We see that a paperclip has many, many more uses than just holding papers together. So if our lens matters, then we might be able to work through different assumptions. And there are 2 different paradigms that we might expose you to today. The idea of traditional OD assumption, organizations and organizing is a problem to be solved. There's this felt need, there's this identification of the problem, an analysis of the cause, an analysis of possible solutions, and action planning. This is a problem-oriented approach. What's wrong? What do we need to fix? The second paradigm is the appreciative inquiry assumption, which is not that organizations are problems to be solved, but rather organizations are a mystery to be embraced. So we appreciate what is possible with this paperclip, not what is its limitations. What might it be? What should it be? And then how will we do it, right? What will it be? How do we actually create it? So think about the difference here between these paradigms. One is problem-focused and one is future-focused.
So the question I would pose for you is, what world do you want to live in, right? So if our approach matters, right, that means that our words matter, as we've seen. And so this is just another way to see the idea of appreciative inquiry. The affirmative topic choice moves into this idea about appreciating what is, right? So instead of working through an organizational problem, saying, what is the problem here? We say, what do you guys do really well? What's going very well here, right? And then we move to the next piece, which is, well, what could be? If these are the things that are going well, what is possible for us in the future? And then how do we design that, right? So if we're dreaming out loud and we imagine what could be, then we move into determining what should be, and then we actually create it. Appreciative inquiry isn't an absence of problems, but it is a different paradigm for which to view organizational opportunities. I would encourage you to read through the text much, much more about the idea of appreciative inquiry and to look even online to explore this paradigm further. You know, as we wrap up this week's podcast, I don't want us to miss out on what these two books are really saying to us. That the idea of hidden forces and discovery and discovering what is, right. The problem-focused approach versus the solution or the future-oriented approach is so very powerful. And both Block and Shine talk extensively about these. I want you to think about how you can apply this into your consulting relationship. So if you're working with somebody on a resume, or you're working with somebody in a consulting relationship for your hat projects, rather than saying what's not working for you, you say, you know, what seems to be going really well, right? And you build on that. You help them kind of see the positive strength side of things. Again, it's not ignoring problems. The strengths-based approach, or the appreciative inquiry approach, is not about sweeping all of the problems under the rug, but rather identifying what is possible through a different source of language. What I would tell you is that your words matter. And don't miss this. Don't miss this. Your words create and construct your future, right? Shine talks extensively about this, and so does Block. Explicit questioning. Don't miss that. Explicit questioning, silence, and a spirit of inquiry are so powerful. And if we just practice those three things, we could avoid an amazing amount of traps in our own life, not only in consulting relationships, but think about what it would be like if you used explicit questionings in your relationships at work. If you, instead of talking so much, you use silence as a tool with your partner, your spouse, or your loved one, or your family, and you just listened to what they had to say, or you were curious, right? So many times I think I might gloss over some of that stuff in my own life. And as the old saying goes, sometimes it's okay to stop and smell the roses. And I know, as cliche as that sounds, and as easy as that might sound, right, and as silly as that might sound, I think if you practice silence and you practice curiosity and you stop to view what's going on around you and you observe the constructs in action in their natural environment, you'll see that you'll never be able to step in the same river twice. And once you step in, you're part of the river. Until next time.